Well, welcome everybody, and we're back to, as I was just mentioning, we're back to Mondays with Russ, and and this is the quintessential Mondays with Russ because we're actually talking about books. Now really, to be fair, we are talking about history because we are, actually trying to do it. Oh, and Ralph has joined us. My gosh, welcome, Ralph. Um, because one of the things that I, have tried to stress, the one of the reasons I'm actually doing this is it's an interesting way to get a perspective on America during this point. So we're talking about the private eye, which is America's, contribution to world literature. We had the consulting detective, you had British cozies, you had all those things, but the American private eye, you know, actually is a unique contribution to this concept of the mystery format. Now, one of the things that's been very interesting, from my point of view, and hi, Willard, I see you're here with us too. Good. One of the things that's interesting from my point of view,
Thank you.
this has been,
I can almost breathe.
a genre concept. You are actually a small subgroup of all the readers, a subgroup of literature. And of course, throughout its entire time, people that are actually committing literature when they write have always looked down on genres in general, on the subgroups, whether that be mysteries or a subgroup of mysteries, which is the private eye, or even if you're talking science fiction or anything else. If it's not true literature, we can't be that serious. But we're going to bridge that gap today. One of the reasons we are here to talk about the person we're here to talk about is he does, for the first time, leap that gap. And consider this: the last person that we spoke about, in the American private eye, the American original, was of course Mike Hammer, and Mickey Spillane. And they of course are the antithesis of high literature. So both of them starting at almost the same time, totally different results, totally different concept of who we're actually dealing with. So with that, I'm ready to start. And you're really kind of lucky, right? Because for the first time, if you think about this, um, this is the first class, so I can't ask you what you got out of this last time, right? Except that's not true. I can ask you, just as a pop quiz, which character goes with which writer? Because we're going to be looking today to see what the difference is in these characters. So, who wrote Sam Spade? Okay. And of course, that was Dashiell Hammett. Philip Marlowe is the creation, of Raymond Chandler, or as they said with the radio program, from the pen of Raymond Chandler, outstanding author of crime fiction. That was from the radio show. Nero Wolfe, of course, was created by Rex Stout. And Mike Hammer, as I already said, was Mickey Spillane. So just to make sure, and one of the points and why we care is because we're going to be looking at the difference between these authors. And remember, with Hammett, who started the concept of the private eye, took the world by storm in the mid 1920s. The big point, though, is he was telling stories set in the era of his times, and thus he grabbed people's attention. He created the concept of the hard boiled detective, and by that we mean someone who could put his feelings on hold to do the job that was necessary, to not be swayed by issues outside the concept of what the mission or the job was. Now, he's tackling the issues of the day, though, and those issues in the 1920s, let's remember he was taking stories straight out of the headlines. His private eye, his operatives were dealing with gangsters, and the gangsters, of course, were the outgrowth
I
of
was trying to take us off
the
of the. I'm
I do
trying to take
so.
us off the picture
Yeah.
and
So Sue, I don't know if you're there, but maybe you could mute. Yeah, there we go. So with this concept, of course, he's hitting the headlines. And one of the reasons, of course, all this came about is Americans did not relate to those drawing room murders that we saw in the British cozies, right? Well, after Hammett, of course, we got to Chandler, and he actually overshadowed Hammett. He sold more books than Hammett had, and he wrote in a much more elegant style. So again, you know, here's Hammett down here in the pulp fiction, with short, terse sentences. But remember, one of the things that I'd brought up is just how similar Dashiell Hammett's work and some guy named Hemingway, who would come just a little bit after, very similar style in the short, terse sentences, in the dropping of any extra words, making the impact much like a short, swift punch, for each sentence. Chandler, of course, wrote longer sentences, and he also did something that we really didn't get. uh, his private eye, Philip Marlowe, was a little more introspective. And that's what we've come to think of as the private eye, the person who is seeing and filtering back all the things he's seeing and giving us, kind of a dialogue, a monologue, if you would, telling us how he feels about some of those things. And that made Chandler, and especially Philip Marlowe, very, very successful. And as I said earlier, if you think about it, even up until last year, they're still making movies with Philip Marlowe, and they're still using original material in some cases that came from Chandler. So, did it have an impact? Yes. And remember, Philip Marlowe is still, he's a little less hard boiled than Spade, but he is a hard man. But he is also the things that Chandler is writing about, the things we are seeing through Philip Marlowe's eyes, are the things from the Depression era. We've moved out of the 20s, and we're in that time of grinding poverty, of a financial depression that's forcing people from the farm into that soulless city, into the decisions that would end up being harmful to others or to themselves. On the other hand, Marlowe was a potential for help for those people. Now, of course, as we moved forward, we saw Rex Stout, who was another elegant writer, but he could easily pull together those short, swift punches of a sentence. And his while Wolfe definitely was upper class and had the you know the taste of a gourmet, with only the best wine, only, well, in his case, beer, but with only the best food and charging outrageous prices. Remember, he was too coming out of the Depression, but he had a service, and he would soak the rich if they needed him, if he was because you only came to Wolfe if he was the only person who could help you. Now, Wolfe's ability to live like a baron at the end of the Depression, and to charge those fees also made him, it was poetic justice, because, in many times Wolfe is saving his clients from their own stupidity, which sold well, of course, with the readers too. It's Archie that had the softer nature and would become the Philip Marlowe type that would embrace the idea of helping someone just to help them. Now, here's something we need to remember, though. Stout also made a great deal of money. Now, all of these men that I've just mentioned did very well, but Hammett only wrote 5 books. Chandler only 7. The last 2, one can ask if they were really good Philip Marlowe books, but both were trying to transcend their pulp background. Stout embraced that pulp background, and he continued to place first-run stories in those pulps, even as the novels were paying big bucks. So what we end up with, is an entire series of novels for Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin, but we end up as well with an equal number of short stories that he continued to place in things like the top selling magazines of the time and commanding large dollars. Now remember, Hammett and Chandler in some ways dissipated their skill because they moved over to that concept of going to the movies. They went out and became screenwriters where they got paid by the week whether they turned something out or not. And thus, in many cases, their output went down precipitously, although in other ways, we did get the Thin Man story, out of all that. So that was worth that. The later Thin Man movies were not from him. So, but with all that, of course, what we see next is the guy who really cleaned up, Mickey Spillane, who set the world on fire with his Mike Hammer books. And he broke all the rules doing so. He literally changed the rules of literature, or at least writing. And one of those rules was the fact that had he tried to send out, had he tried to publish what he wrote in 47, it's very likely he would have ended up on charges, for sexual content. We can read them today and go, well, but far, far more graphic, far more, not so in our world, but certainly what he was writing by the 40s would never have been accepted. And remember, much of what happened with Hammett was out of that response from America's involvement in the Great War. The disillusionment that swept the West after all of the effort, in the Great War, and how badly it all ended, left us wondering why were we ever involved. And, of course, also, ended up where you had, worldwide depression that would follow. But in the early days, it was only in the rural areas. Well, of course, by the time of Spillane, we are now in the post-World War II era. And we're going to talk about that more because, of course, Macdonald is very much the same way. But Spillane, just like the two before him, are writing from the headlines of the newspapers. And, of course, one of the biggest headlines in that post-World War II era is that move toward the idea that there are communist agents, Reds, everywhere. And, Mike Hammer is dedicated to eradicating Reds. So they each wrote about their era. Dashiell Hammett writing about gangsters and prohibition, Chandler with the city and its soulless nature, and the fact that more and more people remember 1920 is that break point where suddenly we've hit the equality moment, but it never looks back again. There are more people living in cities from 1920 on than there are people in rural areas. And Rex Stout writing about the Depression, World War II, and on through the boom times, and Mickey Spillane with the Red Scare. Now remember, in each of these, women would be a driving force. And again, this is that major change from drawing room murders where a woman might be involved behind it, but she was not noticeable. She was not placing herself out there. But in these books, in the Private Eyes, Women are often the driving force, and not just as someone who pulls the characters along. They're neither bashful nor blushing, but some may be victims, but most often, they're either the leading cause for the event or the perpetrator. And certainly we see the rise of the femme fatale, meaning the woman that is trying to lead this man to his demise. And of course, we saw that prominently in the Maltese Falcon, right? So this is the major, major change from the drawing room murders, the cozies, and everything else, where women were to be protected. Here, we're seeing women as an equal part in all of these. And by the way, it is interesting to note Rex Stout tried something very out there in the 40s. He actually wrote, it might have been late 30s, but I'm pretty sure it's 40s. He actually wrote a female private detective, and would end up folding her back into the Nero Wolfe books too. I think he only wrote one, might have been two, but I think there was only one of them where she was featured in her own book. And then interestingly, when he did bring her back into Nero Wolfe, he counted the years between the time of that first book and the time she came back in, and he had aged her appropriately, and she's head of her own detective agency. So we are seeing changes in how women are viewed within these books. But now we're moving into what we're here to talk about tonight, which is Ross Macdonald and his character, which is Lew Archer. The big point, though, is here's the major difference between those stories that we've just talked about and what we're going to find in the Ross Macdonald books. Macdonald stories do not have characters. Macdonald stories have people who have characteristics, and we are going to actually see them, and we are going to hear them, and they're going to react realistically. Remember, I said one of the issues is in later years, people have come to say these are actually not, should not be placed into that genre. These are truly literature. And one of the places we see that first is his treatment of women and their choices, and the choices they make. And those women, with those choices, may have lit the fuse. They may have been the victim. But just as often, men do the same thing in his stories, and they may be the victim or they may be the driving force, but they're all real people. And he shows us their character through their actions. That is a huge change. In many ways, if you think about it, many of these earlier stories are set pieces. And they're much like plays. Oh, this is the character that's going to do this. They're going to drive this action. And they are a character. The Ross Macdonald books have people in them. And that's one of the things we're going to be exploring. But I'm saying Ross Macdonald. Do you know this man? Could you pick him out of a lineup? This actually is Kenneth Millar. He's born in 1915, and my contention, he becomes one of America's most noted fiction writers. So, in fact, at the very least, they consider him the most significant writer in the hard-boiled detective fiction era. And one of the things with that is we're going to see at the end of this why I say that. So, as you know, I always like to give you framing questions to think about. We have done our back study now to bring you all back up to date. So, the questions for tonight: who is Ross Macdonald? Why does he matter in the scope of the detective genre fiction? What motivates his main character, Lew Archer? And if he is largely forgotten today, which is also my contention, why does Ross Macdonald and Lew Archer matter? So I'm just curious, if I were to talk to you and I'd said, Lew Archer, and I don't know if you can do it, but under chats, under the participants era, or under chat, do any of you have any of you read any of the Ross Macdonald books? And here's my other question that I don't have on my list. If Lew Archer is part of America's 1950s, can both Archer and Hammer be representative of their times, which of course is, that's been the concept of why we have been doing these talks. Because of course I talk about American history, and my point being, each of these men, as I just showed you, have given us a window into an individual's look at American history, primarily through the decade that their character was hot. Now, we already saw that Rex Stout suddenly changed all that. Unlike the others, he stretches from 1939 to 1973. Ross Macdonald, Lew Archer will stretch from 1949 to, I think, 1975. So, and we're going to see, how he perceives what we see through his eyes. So those are the framing questions, and that last one I think is important. Can both Lew Archer and Mike Hammer be representative of their times? And if so, how? So here we go. Now, one of my contentions has always been that something that has made a huge difference in the longevity of A Private Eye is whether or not they get out beyond just that printed material. Sam Spade, of course, really there's only one Sam Spade book. That's kind of shocking. It's Maltese Falcon. Of course, they've made the Maltese Falcon into a movie 3 times within the first 10 years. And you get the quintessential concept of that, with the joining of, a great director and a great actor pulling that together for us, in the final movie of that group. So, with that, that actually has a lot to do with having kept them alive. And then, of course, we got the radio shows for Sam Spade, which were nothing like the Sam Spade of the books. The Sam Spade of the books defines what we mean by hard boiled. Sam Spade of the books is in it for himself. And we're going to be talking about that as we compare that to what Lew Archer is like. But here you see, and I think we all recognize, this was the first movie outing, but he was not called Lew Archer. He was called Lew Harper, because Paul Newman, they originally wanted Frank Sinatra for the role and he turned it down, but they got Paul Newman, and Paul Newman had been on a massive streak of big hit movies, and all of those hit movies had started with H. So he wanted the next movie, as a superstition or anything else, he wanted it to start with an H. And the easiest way to do that, even though it was doing the very first book, they changed the name from Archer to Harper, and in doing so, called the movie Harper. So one of the things is, we did not get that concept of more books sold and more information about that character being out there. We'll talk a little bit about the movie, but it is a pretty good. I actually like the movie a great deal, although they changed a rather significant item. But remember, the movie was made in 1966, almost 20 years after the book had hit. And really, it's a very good change for the movie, and for the story for 1966 as well. Because, of course, I'm saying that all of these are part of their times. And remember, he is writing just after post-war America. I'd mentioned that Hammett had lived with world disillusionment by the waste and futility of war, but Millar is populating one where the Americans were empowered by their victory in World War II. We all know, we grew up in this era. We all know we won the war, right? The seriously, until you actually do a lot more uh, reading and learning in history that you find out really how important, I don't know, the Russians and the sacrifices the Soviets made to that end as well. So, but of course, we also had mastered science and produced the A bomb. Was there anything we thought we could not do? That becomes, a pretty big thing. So, uh, with that, it's a whole different era, but that era has an impact on the writers. So, I'd already said this is Kenneth Millar. In doing so, while he's now considered one of those most noted fiction writers, it did not start that way. In fact, he had difficulty. He and his wife, the woman that would become his wife, had met in school. Um, his wife is also a writer, and his wife, you know, they both made their literary debut in their school paper in 1931. They would both pursue writing, and by the 1940s, she's a success at it. She also writes mystery and suspense, and her early work is great, very well accepted. Although we need to think about this, she writes male oriented mysteries, meaning her lead characters are men. But the difference in her work, if you go back and read any of them, you will find the women are real people as well. They are much more sympathetic characters than what you were getting in the other works. In fact, this is a list of just her work through about 1960. She would win an Edgar Award in 1955, and a couple of her works would actually go on to be on television on the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. I don't know how many of you remember that show, but I remember watching it personally, really enjoying it. But she was a respected author. Her husband, on the other hand, Kenneth, had had 4 strikes in his first 4 books, meaning he wasn't doing well. Now his publisher really likes his writing and they want him to succeed. A little different than today, where it's, you've gotta be hot out of the box or forget it. He'd already had 4 underachieving books. So a couple of things happen. One, they say, you're going to need to change your name because people have already made up their mind about you. So he comes up with a name and he uses actually father and grandfather's name, which is an interesting aspect that we're going to cover as well later. He comes out with his first book of Lew Archer, The Moving Target, uh, under the name of John Ross Macdonald. He'll end up dropping John later. But, after those 4 non-sellers, in 47, he submits that first Lew Archer novel, and they work hard on him and with him with many rewrites, many changes, pushing things back and forth to him to rewrite it, write it again. And in doing so, they're also directing him to go with what works. And clearly, he is influenced by those who came before him, which means, Chandler and Hammett. And in fact, so much so, think about this. I said the main character's name is Lew Archer. Remember in the Maltese Falcon, who was Sam Spade's partner who got murdered, the first victim of Bridget O'Shaughnessy. Uh, his name was Archer, right? So it's really very much an homage to the Maltese Falcon. It takes almost 2 years. It's 18 months. The publisher finally deems that it's ready. By the way, he got the name Lew from the writer of Ben-Hur, Lew Wallace. And of course, Lew Wallace had been a famous Civil War general as well, right? So, um, so he is definitely influenced by those who came before him. You know, so and this early pen name, they say it is to separate his work from his wife's work, who's already growing in popularity. But really, much of that is you need to break new ground. Well, does he break new ground with the book Moving Target? It owes so much to Chandler. You read it. If I just tell you the plot, you would tell me, well, wait a minute. Wasn't that Chandler's Big Sleep with a little bit of Farewell, My Lovely thrown in there? His early writing style is certainly similar to Chandler's. He likes Chandler's work. I'm going to, throughout this talk, I'm going to be reading you a lot of his material. Now, remember, last time I'd read you some of the work that Mickey Spillane was doing. And of course, today the Mickey Spillane work is so we make fun of it. It is so over the top that we end up making fun of it. But what we see here is just this piece I'm going to read you is going to sound a lot like Chandler. I could find this in a Chandler book easily. There was a wheelchair standing beside her, but she didn't look like an invalid. She was very lean and brown, tanned so dark her flesh seemed hard. Her hair was bleached, curled lightly on her narrow head like blobs of whipped cream. Her age was as hard to tell as a figure carved from mahogany. Now, that may seem a little over the top, but certainly that is a quality use of words. You see that person as a person in your eyes. And what we start to see very quickly from this first book is his joining with Chandler for the idea of the plots and for some of the characterization. Lew Archer is very much in the same vein as as Philip Marlowe. He does not have the wisecracks, but he definitely has that personality. And as I always say, if you're going to emulate someone, make it the best. And that is what Chandler is at this point. Now, while his plots are clearly inspired by Chandler and Lew Archer might be Philip Marlowe's descendant, they are also different people. We see that. But something to remember here, it's 1947, and that's hammer time. 1947, I said it was 49 when this book is coming out, but 47, 48 is when they're working at it. That is the moment that Mickey Spillane kicks off with I, the Jury. And Spillane owns the 1950s bestseller list. Spillane really writes these 6 books. After that, he's sporadic up and down in his quality and his style. One could say that Mickey Spillane is sporadic in his style anyway. Just the opposite of Ross Macdonald. Every Ross Macdonald book will get better. Way up until the end at least. And then it's a little bit more dicey. But there's no competition with Spillane. Ross Macdonald's work is not threatening Spillane's, ownership of that era at all. And my point to that is we need to remember that while Ross Macdonald is channeling Chandler in writing this, and he's not the last author to do so, Robert B. Parker with the Spencer series very clearly does the exact same thing with his first book. Nothing that Ross Macdonald is threatening the bestseller list at all. And the world has moved beyond Chandler, one could argue, but maybe not. Maybe just all the people buying it. Macdonald's work is growing into his own voice. By the 3rd book, he is certainly, the way some people die, he is certainly moving into that ownership of his own style. Very much the same with Robert B. Parker and Spencer, but no matter what, from the first book, his point of view is far, far different than that of Mickey Spillane's and Mike Hammer's. But because of all that, the 1950s would be very hard for Ross Macdonald. The style is there, his followers are growing, but it's tough. Now, as I said, let's look a little bit more at some of his writing. This is out of that first book. He's speaking with that woman that we were talking about. I used to think the world was divided into good people and bad people. Okay. All right. I'm going to start that again just in case. I used to think the world was divided into good people and bad people, that you could pin responsibility for evil on certain definite people and punish the guilty. And he's talking to this woman. He says, I'm still going through the motions and I'm talking too much, aren't I? But when she asks him what exactly he means that she can't follow him, he's saying, well, I'm a cop. And he goes, I believed that evil was a quality that some people were born with, like a hair lip, like a cop's job was to find those people and put them away. But evil isn't so simple. Everybody has it in him, and whether it comes out in his actions depends on a number of things: environment, opportunity, economic pressure, a piece of bad luck, a wrong friend. The trouble is, a cop has to go on judging people by rule of thumb and acting on that judgment. And she says to him, do you judge people? And his answer is very telling. Everyone I meet. The graduates of police schools make a big deal of scientific detection, and that has its place. But most of my work is watching people and judging them. And you find evil in everyone? Just about. Either I'm getting sharper or people are getting worse. And that could be. War and inflation always raises a crop of stinkers, and a lot of them have settled in California. There's a little bit of humor there, but there's a lot of straight talk there as well, right? And we see it today in all of our TV shows. And remember, this is something I want you to think about. What we saw in those books I talked about. Here we've got the very hard-boiled Sam Spade starting it all, and the Continental Op before him, which was also written by Hammett. But people who are making judgments, and they're making those judgments and deciding which one works for them. And what we see here is him saying, that's what you have to do as a cop. You have to judge. And that is what we do. And think of all of our TV shows yet today. Oh, I've got a gut feeling about this. Still the same, isn't it? And then we move into Chandler. And Chandler puts a softer edge on it. His person, unlike Sam Spade, who's weighing it to see what works for Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe really could be Sir Lancelot, couldn't he? He's really a knight coming out to save people, and we see that in some of the stories. Chandler pokes a little fun at himself in some cases with that. And there's no doubt, Mickey Spillane, his guy is not a knight, and his guy is not really in it for himself. He's not there to save anybody. He's an avenger. You're going to die. I'm going to be the one that kills you if you hurt my friend. But remember, this is coming into the 1950s now, and that's the rise of that soulless society. Think about it. The books that are popular, the things that are happening, the rise of IBM, the rise of the big corporations, all of these things happening, all of these things that are going on. The man in the gray flannel suit, the idea that everybody has to fit in. They should all look alike, be alike, act alike. We still have a little bit of that today, don't we? And of course, we have the reaction to it. The organization man. And remember, it's also the rise of the original computers and the idea that everything can be added up. That's another thing he was actually just saying, right? We put all this information in. I'm watching it all. I'm just pulling it all in, and then we add it up to see how it comes out. It's just business, right? Of course, that comes back to what we would see in 1969 with the Godfather movie coming out, right? It's just business. But of course, the thing is, we're moving into the 50s and there is affluence. People have cars, people have houses. We've got homes, cars, television, and money by the end of the 1950s, but we seem maybe to be losing sight of what matters. And that, of course, becomes a big issue both in the last books that we would see under Chandler, the books we see with both, Hammer and with Lew Archer. It's a lot about looking at society and saying, what's going on here? And that's one of the things, one of the reasons we're looking at these books. They are a part of that American history and that moment in time. And remember, this is a picture of Levittown, which all the houses look the same. All of them must be the same. And we haven't gotten away from that, have we? Now, what do we have? We have, HOAs where they enforce that you have to look the same. While there's affluence, as I said, something might be missing and we want everybody to look the same. But what about those people in the 50s that could not look the same? The ones that could not fit in? They could end up being harassed, and we would see that. And of course, you have entire groups that want to enforce that everybody stays the same as well. So the 1950s, while his audience is growing, Macdonald's books don't catch on fire the way that Mike Hammer's books did. He's living from book to book. He's struggling between publication dates. Now, remember, his wife's still doing very well. Kenneth Millar, the person behind Ross Macdonald, is going to suffer, and he will actually seek professional help with his depression. It is a crash, but it's also a redemption, because as the 1950s turn into the 1960s, Macdonald's work is gaining more notice, especially as that change is coming in our world, where some people are rejecting the idea that everybody has to think alike, that everybody has to be the same. By the 1960s, his books are actually looking at, how that plays out, because he's got a secret of his own. Ross Macdonald is not just a name that he's adopted. This is a man who's also got a history and an issue. And as we said, when he starts, talking to a psychiatrist, he starts looking a little deeper into characters and characterization. Big thing is, Lew Archer is not that knight that Philip Marlowe is, and he's definitely not an Avenger. He's a very quiet observer. He sees everything. And in seeing it, he will see the excesses. He will see, the truths people tell, but also the lies they tell themselves. And he lays down that truth in the story. Even if he doesn't say it to anybody, we hear it, we see it. And that style is emerging. And what we are actually seeing is the stories behind his plots start to come together to be a theme that, burying the past never works. Burying a lie certainly never works. And we're going to see why that matters to him as well. But he also has a way with words. Another example, 3 or 4 miles beyond the end of the pier, a half dozen oil platforms blazed with lights like leafless Christmas trees. And off to the north, like a menacing West Coast Statue of Liberty, a giant gas flame flared. He's describing an oil rig, right? He's describing the things that you saw in the 60s and 70s. And he does that throughout all of his books. And he doesn't say anything bad about them. He just describes it. You get to see it too. Now, depending on the story and the situation, he may look down on what he sees, and he may, make that observation with enough of a wry sound that how he feels about it. Southern California, that land with the short hairs and the long hairs, the potheads and the acid heads, draft dodgers and dollar chasers, swingers and the walking wounded, idiot saints, hard cases, foolish virgins, and all of those that would use them all. That's from his book, The Instant Enemy, in 1968. It's very easy to read his material. It flows. It has, it's got a cadence and a style that makes it inviting. His wry asides are often aimed at the rich who seem unaware of the damage they're doing. His lines, though often throwaways, still seem to score hits. A couple of these, just for example, the pure blue of the imperturbable Pacific, which often seems to rebuke the shabbiness of dealings on land or the arrogance of the rich Californians who live in the canyons with a haze like a thin smoke from slowly burning money. That's from that's his first book, The Moving Target. It was a gathering who did not appreciate how rare their good fortune was and how their choices might affect others. They may well be dining on prime ribs of unicorn or breast of phoenix under glass. Another look at that concept that, people see things differently, and the people with money may not see how it's seen by others. But he's moving into the 1960s and his popularity starts growing because suddenly there is a reaction to that gray flannel suit, the organization man, and we start seeing protests. We start seeing people speaking out. And one of the things, that we have to remember is we went into the 60s, we were very divided. I keep hearing people telling me how divided we are today, and we've never been that divided. I, of course, think, well, there was a thing called the Civil War, but there was also the 1960s when, we were so divided that we shot, the speakers that opposed our point of view. It was at this point, though, that we also start having some of the clearly unnecessary happenings, that are all about just simply abuse of the use of money. He's coming back on a plane in one of his books, it's Sleeping Beauty, and he looks out the window. An offshore oil platform stood up out of its windward end like a metal handle of a dagger that had been stabbed into the world and made it spill black blood. It's a true statement, isn't it? That's actually what's happening. One of the things we have to remember, the one thing he and his wife did for a hobby besides writing was they were birders. And of course, these oil spills affected birds very, very badly. But it's not just the oil spills, is it? One of his other stories, I drove up to a house on a private road that widened at the summit into a parking apron. When I got out of my car, I could look back over the city and see the towers of the mission and the courthouse half submerged in smog. That was our world, wasn't it? That was what things looked like in the big cities. Before we passed those regulations, he's doing nothing more than recounting what he saw. He doesn't make any statement whether that's good or bad. He just tells you it's there. And of course, it was there. This is the parking lot at LAX, Los Angeles International Airport. And of course, one of the other things that will end up being in many of his stories, are the wildfires, much like the one that just struck in California again. But that look, and one of his books that became one of his bestsellers, The Underground Man, deals specifically with that. But much like the city became a character in a Chandler novel, that wildfire becomes a force within that book, The Underground Man. And as it moves and works its way in, it's breathing, it is following, it is pursuing. And as the country slides into the 1970s and the response to all these successes starts to prove out, Macdonald's work proves out. Archer points out, though, as I said, that theme that he has, He points out that the skeletons of the past always come out, even while they're hidden, they skew the future. And that is true for Ross Macdonald as well. Now, his later books, there's The Underground Man in that one, The Goodbye Look, all of these, are very heavy, and his work is good. Now, of course, because he's becoming a name, you know, people are asking his thoughts and his opinions. And of course, the same thing had happened with Chandler, and they asked Chandler to weigh in on Hammett. And that's when Chandler gave us the famous "Down these mean streets a man must go who himself is not mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid. He's the hero. He is everything. He must be a complete man and a common man, yet an unusual man." And what Chandler is telling us, he's saying that's what Hammett created. Well, really, that's what Chandler creates out of the pieces that Hammett gave us, because certainly Sam Spade was that strong man, that complete man, and the unusual man with very common interests. And we saw that Sam Spade, definitely not afraid, but maybe a little tarnished. In creating The Private Eye, Hammett created the rules for the private eye as a successful character. Chandler honed those and said that that character must be the hero, must save people, must go forward that way. And what we find out, we have Macdonald who will honor Chandler, because of course it was Chandler that I said that he had, that he had emulated. And Macdonald tells us that Raymond Chandler wrote like a slumming angel. And of course, where was he slumming? He was slumming in the city of Los Angeles. Chandler had set his books in that seedy underbelly of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s Los Angeles, with all the grime, the moral decay, and all of that, layered over with Hollywood glamour, but it was still behind it. And that's the part that Macdonald takes forward. You can paint over rot in wood, it will still come out. The California sun beat down on ugliness and beauty alike, and Chandler strove to capture that combination in his writings. Absolutely true. But it's Macdonald then that takes it one step further. I said that the vital point that came out was the idea that that person that we're following is the hero. He's everything. It's that creation of mythology. Can we have, here is a vital point and a question I have to ask, because these are the differences now that come between all of these. And this is how we move from that genre writing to the actual literature that we're starting to see turned out. Can we have the Maltese Falcon without Sam Spade? Can you imagine that? No, it's not possible. Sam Spade is the key. He changes everything that happens in that book from the moment he gets involved, doesn't he? Sam Spade in the book is far more ruthless than Bogart in the movie. But even in the movie, it's Spade that drives everything from that time when he becomes involved. Spade thwarts the plans of the guys, and he then institutes his own plan, right? And of course, the big crux moment for the book and the movie, it's forcing the audience to decide, with what we know about Sam Spade, what's he going to do? It balances on the edge of a knife blade. Is he going to throw her over to the police, or is he going to hide her crime? But remember, that's the key, right? And of course, Macdonald says that's why you can't have another Sam Spade book. That's why there's only one. He's no longer the person he was. He was changed and a different person by the result of that story. He's not a catalyst that does not change in and of himself. He is part of that action. And when he makes his choice, it changes his life. So that's vital point number one. We've seen what that strong central character, that private eye, we've seen what it does. But point number two, we suddenly start to see that as Chandler takes over, we don't have that person of Sam Spade, the guy that's weighing things. Definitely Philip Marlowe's on the side of the person who is down. When he goes through the slums and he sees those bad things happening to people, much like what we heard, Lew Archer say in that very first set of readings I did, he's well aware that it can be a happenstance, it can be poverty, it can be the people it can be where you happen to be at that moment or where you're stuck because of your situation. Marlowe becomes their defender in many cases, but even Marlowe, as we see by the end, gets his feet tangled up in a lot of their problems. And of course, Hammer defends no one. As I said earlier, he is their avenger, but he's not an avenging angel. Hammer is anything but an angel. And of course, that's why he stands out as an archetype. All three of those people are larger than life, right? They are characters from a book. The vital point number three is that we need to understand Lew Archer, and this is where we see that concept that Ross Macdonald transcends the idea of it just being genre fiction. He's writing to the best of his ability, and he will do very well, and he will crack the New York Times bestseller list a couple of times. And remember, he's not doing it with paperbacks the way the Mike Hammer books did, at 50 cents a throw. He's doing it in the 60s at $5 a throw with hardbounds, and into the 70s where they're $7.50 or something like that. He's doing it with real money. And in doing so, in creating that entire thing, we see Lew Archer grow as a character. And as those books continue, that character type that had started under Hammett, morphed under Chandler, changes again under Macdonald. And what we really see is very consciously, Macdonald says Archer is the recorder, the historian of the event. And he treats him, as I'd said earlier, all the people in his books are very much real people. He tries to mirror what they would do based on what he knows about real people, what he knows about real life as he sees things unfold. And thus, in that way, my entire purpose of saying we use these books to get a snapshot in time to see how at least one person saw the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, in that these books are absolutely great. The key thing is, while Archer is related to Marlowe in style early on, he changes. He becomes that person. And who is he? And this is what Ross Macdonald says about him. The essential thing that Archer does in the books is that he discovers. It's not what he does, it's what he discovers. Archer is that recorder, as I said. Archer is the opposite of Spade. He is not the driver of events. He is the witness to the forces that are driving the event, that are driving the story and the plot. He is that person who's seeing it happen, much like real life. He's not riding in to rescue anyone. He might be trying, but really, in the later books, he's come to realize this is, that fuse has been lit. This process is happening. All I can do is try to understand why, and that will lead me to where and what is driving this. But really, he's actually, in most cases, seeing the results of that, of that truth finally coming out after time. Because in the Macdonald books, the thing driving the plot is a truth that has been buried or perverted. And thus, really, Macdonald is using him as that party to see it happen. Now, who's Archer? In The Barbarous Coast, it demonstrates how a detective novel can, in the hands of a writer as sensitive as MacDonald, both accurately describe and savagely comment on the deterioration and malaise that exists behind the facade of a high-flying consumer society. That was written for the 100th anniversary of Ross Macdonald's birth, Kenneth Millar's birth, in 2015, because people were looking back to say, wow, what's up with this? And what is the draw to a MacDonald's work? MacDonald draws an achingly clear picture of every person involved. And over the course of a story, we see that more than the surface that they present, but we see the person they really are because we see their actions. That reveal is driven by facts, often ones that have been long buried, long ignored. And while they may be forgotten, unknown, or ignored, MacDonald knows that truth will come out. Their reaction will define the person, and that will be the outcome of the story. Remember, as Archer said in that first book, everyone has evil in him, and whether it comes out in his action depends on a number of things: environment, opportunity, economic pressure, a piece of bad luck, a wrong friend. Those are big things. And to MacDonald, they were truths. And that is a big thing. MacDonald is exploring the significance of the past. He says he's writing modern legends, exploring that significance of that past as it intrudes itself on the present, because it will, won't it? We've seen that in our lifetimes, haven't we? Think about that. That's one of the things that really has happened, right? Remember, though, the past is vital for MacDonald, and his feeling toward it is really, intrinsic within him. Kenneth Millar's life was anything but simple. His mother became an invalid. She was a nurse, and she was treating typhoid in the hospital. She got it, and she became an invalid. And he was probably between 3 and 4. His father tried for a little while and then just disappeared. He abandoned them, and that's before Kenneth turns 4. So, like Herbert Hoover, as I told you with him, his father had died, then his mother dies. All of a sudden, he's passed relative to relative to be looked after. Herbert Hoover was lucky. He only went through 2 homes. What MacDonald would tell us is that by the time he was 16, he had lived in 50 different houses. Now, by the time he gets to be 16, he returns home to help care for his mother because he's gotten old enough to do that. But he had been passed from relative to relative. He knew how choices in the past affect and infect the present and all possible futures. That's a big deal. And the biggest thing is, as I said, where in other stories, for PIs, women are the driving force, but it's usually a very basic force. That's not what we see in a MacDonald story. His women are real women. They may be the murderer. They may be the person that's the victim, but we see them as they really are. And that's a big deal. MacDonald stories do not have characters. They have people, and we see those people. That makes it a big difference. And what happens is by the 70s, the critics are noticing. And most of these critics are people that are authors themselves who have made it, who have made a name. One of the early ones to embrace MacDonald's work was Eudora Welty, who was very well known. She was the queen of the Southern novel, and its particular style. And of course, that would matter to her because that sense of history, of course, is very prevalent in those types of books as well. She would write nationally, and in fact, she would start offering her reviews as blurbs for his early books. She would say a more serious and complex writer than Chandler and Hammett ever were. That's how she felt about Ross Macdonald. William Goldman, who we know as an award-winning screenplay writer, but also, of course, wrote a couple of books. And of course, we know him from many stories. I'm thinking he did Marathon Man, among other things. But he was also the screenplay writer for that first Paul Newman movie where they were adapting the book. He says that the Archer books are the finest series of detective novels ever written by an American. End of statement, end of sentence. And Macdonald is more than a mystery writer. He is a major American novelist. And that's according to a front page New York Times book magazine review, which never, ever happened with genre literature. Remember, by the mid 70s, that starts to change, because of course, science fiction becomes something that instead of being consigned to the trash bin, with the multi-zillion dollars netted by the Star Wars movie, suddenly it gets accepted. But here the difference is it's the quality of the writing, not the fact that, much like Mike Hammer, that the public embraced it. It's the quality of the writing winning over other real writers. Now, I said he's largely forgotten. I think I got one note here, and thank you very much. I think it was Linda Madden that said, she's read 2 of the 3 Archer at Large books. Mary's read all 3. Those are, they were kept alive. The publishers would continue to publish these for a while. But why does Macdonald matter today? Some of you may have read these people: Sue Grafton, who wrote the Kinsey Millhone series, The Female Private Detective; Robert B. Parker, who wrote The Spencers; James Ellroy, who, of course, is absolutely top notch when it comes to what back then was called crime fiction; Michael Connelly, Richard North Patterson, Jonathan Kellerman, all who were, become names and have been read by many people. All of them cite Macdonald as a primary influence, just as Macdonald cited Chandler as a primary influence. Macdonald's contributions to the detective novel and American popular culture have been profound. By the way, if you read the Sue Graftons, she's from Santa Barbara, much like he was. And, of course, in his books, in Macdonald's books, Archer is based in what was it, Santa Teresa, and that's exactly the city she places Kinsey Millhone. So that is that homage and much, saying much about the quality. But there's other people that he influenced because he was out there. One of them was a guy who had become a pretty big rock name, Warren Zevon. Werewolves of London is probably his biggest hit. Send Money, Guns, and Lawyers. He's was a big name. He's passed at this point, but he was having a terrible time in his life, but he was a big fan of the Lew Archer novels. And when he had been at a party, he had introduced himself. They had met. But as he would say, at the lowest point in my life, the doorbell rang, and there, quite literally, was Lew Archer, in the body of Ross Macdonald, on a compassionate mission, come to save my life. And they did. They got him on his feet. He would dedicate one of his subsequent albums to Kenneth Millar. So we have looked at the life and times. There's one other, I mentioned Eudora Welty. When she wrote him a note saying, when she'd written a positive review of his work, he sent a note saying, this is my first ever fan letter, but I've loved your work from the very start. The two of them would become pen pals for the rest, well, almost the rest of their life. And in doing so, she kept all the letters. And you read those, and they read a little bit like a courtship. They never, in today's vernacular, they never hooked up. And in all the letters, there is a level of, you know, personal intimacy on terms of knowing each other over all these years and discussing everything. And of course, they would, it would, you know, constantly come back around. They'd say all these things and then say, "And how's your wife?" Um, things like that. She's a Southern spinster, he's a married man. But they were so dedicated to each other that when they would be on the road for different things, because they were always exchanging these notes, they would tell each other where they were going to be, not to be able to hook up, but so that the notes could be sent to their hotel room during that time they were gone so they could continue the conversations. Now, one of the things, I said that I think the last novel is about 75 or 76 for, Ross Macdonald. And, we need to realize that Ross Macdonald, as you just heard, really and truly, he created, much like some of his characters, he went and created a personality that worked for what he had to do. And we see that personality in Ross Macdonald, go much farther than the personality that was Kenneth Millar ever could. Um, much like those characters, he stepped up and stepped into the things he had to do. And in some ways, that was the character that became friends with Eudora Welty. And when she came to realize that there was something wrong with his letters, she realized he was slipping into what we now call Alzheimer's. And she went to visit him. And, as the letters started dwindling and finally stopped, she came to visit him. And, the things she wrote, all of those things that were inside your head that made you who you are now gone. And she said, but there are always the letters, because she had them all and they've been published, and they are a warm, wonderful read, by the way. But again, we see these characters and how they interact, and we see the person who could write about real people and bring that across in his items. His wife's, career continued on well. She, had a gap where she was caring for him, and she yet came back again and wrote after his passing. So, you know, that is the life of this person in books that have life. Now, I will tell you, I had given you these questions. Who was Ross Macdonald? Well, I've tried to show you who he is in the book, why he matters in the scope of the detective genre. I hope you can feel that you see it. We notice that what motivates Lew Archer is totally different than what motivated Sam Spade, than what motivated Philip Marlowe, than what motivated really even Nero Wolfe or Mike Hammer. But what motivates Lew Archer is often rather real, isn't it? And if he's largely forgotten today, I said, why does he matter? Look at all those people he influenced. Those are huge, huge things. So, with that, I will tell you a few things. One, all of his books, not, I should back up, many of his best writings have been collected into 3 volumes by the Library of America. But there's a library book sale coming up. You may or may not find some of the old printings there, but he was coming out at that time where Literary Guild and the Mystery Book Club would frequently collect his books into 3-in-1 volumes. And that's the way a lot of mine are. I then by the 70s, I'm buying them as they came out, late 60s. I think Underground Man on, I was buying them as they came out on the stand. But you know, his work is still accessible, is my point. And you know, the nice thing about those Library of America books is you also get some of the other essays that I talked about and things like that, where you don't have to do what I did, was go out and dig for them. And the other thing we see is, you know, we have been teaching in school the Maltese Falcon or the, Big Sleep, mainly because of the influence on the crime noir movies. But there are people that are arguing we should be teaching, Lew Archer and the works of Ross Macdonald in schools. And in doing this talk, I found a lot of the papers that are theses and PhD works that are arguing why Ross Macdonald and Lew Archer matter. And clearly that's out there. Now, here is my guilty secret. The one thing about the Ross Macdonald books, I would get very frustrated by them because it always goes back to history. And one of the things is you rarely do you guess, what the denouement will be, what the outcome will be, or what was the driving item. But it's always going to be a long chain of circumstances that go back to something in history. And I would find that a little bit frustrating, as a single read, absolutely excellent. But my point to all this is, what I have a very difficult time doing, I binge read normally. I can only binge read 2 or 3 of his books in one setting. After that, it's like, God, stop. So those 3-in-1 volumes do work very well, but they may not be to your taste because, as I said, he's not creating a Mount Olympus with these heroes that have been put in place. And remember, that was kind of the concept. If you really look at Maltese Falcon, that's Sam Spade is the first anti-hero. He does not match up with the true heroic concept because he's in it for him. Philip Marlowe clearly does match that heroic mode. He could be Sir Lancelot. And of course, Spencer, who is highly influenced by Philip Marlowe. The first 2 Spencer books are very much, just they could be the extension of Philip Marlowe's works if you just erased them and changed the name. But bottom line being, they are worth the read. They are a look at the history and the times and the people and the things we were worried about at that moment. So with that, I am going to shut this down so that I can see you all better. And I'm going to ask any questions, thoughts. Was this the program you would hope to hear? Feel free to unmute yourself. We've got a couple minutes. I had originally intended to try and bring this in an hour and 15. That's about what I did this morning as well. So all good. I hope it met your needs, but don't get used to the idea of me going less than an hour and a half to 2 hours. Okay. Because we got some heavy stuff coming up next week, with the Dakota uprising and things like that. So questions, thoughts? Are you glad you attended? Did I put you all to sleep? That's always possible. My melodious voice does that.
You never put us to sleep, Russ.
Well, thank you, Ralph. I appreciate that.
I got a question.
I hope you enjoyed it. I tried to give you some background to the person, what makes him different, but what makes him important. And I do recommend you at least read a couple of them. They certainly are a picture of their period and their time.
Yeah.
Looks like I got something over here in chat. Let's see if I can. So, all right, Sandy, thank you. It was interesting as I didn't know much about these characters. A lot to think about. Yeah, and that's very true. That was a lot of download there. But thank you for being here on this first day. It's nice to have you all back. It's wonderful to have had a chance to chat with a lot of you before the class started too. So, we're going to be doing this every Monday night. So one of the things I do hope to see you back. So, questions, thoughts?
I have an observation.
Yes.
I confess one of my guilty pleasures is soap operas.
Okay.
And as you were talking about the character development, the realness of the characters, one of the things that I've noticed over the years is how the best ones do such a good job of developing character that you can almost anticipate what they're going to say.
Yep.
Or what they're going to do. And I guess my question is it possible that what he did with his characters influenced the writing on, say, soap operas?
I don't have any factual knowledge of that. I could see how that could happen. Because you don't know what they're reading, right?
Mm-hmm.
What influences them. So, and remember, those soap operas were radio shows before they became TV shows, and the detective genre was very, very strong on the radio networks.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I could see that as a possible, and the key thing is he was striving to make the quality of his work better. Mm-hmm. And we know for a fact that he certainly did well with improving those characters. So thank you, Carol. I appreciate the note. Glad you got to make it, and I'm glad you could use the chat room too. So, all right. Well, I'll just ask this: anybody intend to go out and look up a Lew Archer novel and give it a read? I would actually suggest, if you can, and I would almost bet it's on Prime or many of the other streaming services. You get a chance. It is not a bad idea to go watch Harper. I enjoy that movie. As I said, there is a key change between the book and the movie, and it is a perfect change to reflect the realities of the 1960s as well, which was when it was made. So, really and truly, Paul Newman does a great job with it. Now, Drowning Pool, which actually is based on the second book, came out 9 years later. It's different. Quite honestly, it is a very different, and they changed some key things in that to make it work. Again, worth watching. It was a good movie at the time. It's a diversion. It is not a blockbuster, but certainly worth it. And nothing about it will ruin reading the story later. So, whereas, if you watch the movie for Harper, you will know, the key instances and points of the book. But I always recommend seeing the movie before you read the book, because otherwise you're just disappointed in the movie. So, all right, that's what I've got. Anybody else have anything? If you do go read one, let me know what you think. That, they're not going to be for everybody. They are not. In our world, if you really think about it, one of the reasons I say he's also faded, we're used to heroic fiction at this point. Think about it, from Star Wars on, that wiped out think of all the movies that preceded Star Wars. I always say one of the reasons it was so successful is because it was an upbeat ending. Whereas, all the movies that we were, from throughout the early part of the 70s, almost all the movies, if you are a down and out person that's having some trouble, you're not going to succeed. You're not going to win. You're going to see the man crush, your rebellion, which of course, think about it. Cool Hand Luke, and everything else. I mean, you are going to see those pushbacks, but we've come to embrace fantasy from 77 on, and these books do not embrace fantasy. They are very much, an effort to look at reality of what happens when you suppress history and truth. So, there you go. And that, to your point, Joan, if you kind of think about it, there is a piece of soap opera there, right? So, yeah. All right, folks, if you don't have anything else, okay. And Sandy mentioning that she read all of them. By the time she got to T, she kind of lost her mojo. I'm going to say something. Sandy is mentioning the Sue Grafton books. And one of the reasons I said what I said, you do come to understand maybe a little bit more why some of the Sue Grafton books go in the direction they do. She's very much emulating what her hero had done with his books. And because there were some of the Sue Grafton books I'd read and go, why would she do that? Why would this character do that? And she was following in the line of very much a situation that she had seen in some of his writings, so that she could explore a similar issue. But yeah, I will say I felt she'd come back by the end, just so you know, if you did say you read them all. So, but yes, there were points that she was losing steam. So yeah. All right.
Thanks, Russ.
Thank you, Sue.
Everybody, and remember, everybody, next week is the Dakota Uprising.
So see you there. Have a good
we'll be there.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to see you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Russ.
Thank you. Good to see you. Bye-bye.